was talking to like our data partner, and he was like, we have like a statistically significant sample come back. The result is like suspiciously large. I was like, oh God, like suspiciously bad? He's like, no, like all these core metrics are substantially in the green. And it really objectively, empirically showed that craft does affect the business, right? It is not kind of like a vanity exercise in doing art school in software. It's like this thing can really have like a tangible impact on those things.
Welcome to Dive Club. My name is Rid, and this is where designers never stop learning. This week's episode is with Janum Trivedi, who makes some of the most stunning prototypes in all of design. So a big goal of this conversation is to answer the question, what makes software feel great? Janum's going to share about his experience redesigning the iOS app for Netflix and talk a little bit about what makes his role at Airbnb so unique. And he even doubles my understanding of shaders in this conversation. But first, I asked him to tell us what it was like building the download animation for the Arc browser.
I was working with Dustin Senos, who's the head of design over there. And, he was kind of working on this render of this download animation that'd be like very fun and physical and, it kind of does that nice loop. My job was to kind of take that idea and take that render and figure out how we bring it to life. When you're working in a traditional design tool, whether that's Figma or After Effects, it's one thing to make an interaction or animation that plays well in that because you're kind of controlling all the environmental variables. And then it's another thing to figure out how do you make this interaction or animation generalizable and feel great in every instance, right? How close is the download link to where it's going to end up, right? Is it, like an inch away on the screen, or is it like a crossover here? I think probably the biggest thing that I was trying to explore was, first is how do we decide what curve this icon is going to take? My first stab at building a prototype for this was messing around with Bezier curves. Cool, control points, move on with my life. You can kind of do that, but then the next question is, at what pace does the icon need to move at along that curve? And this is kind of where the Bezier curve starts breaking down, because if you just pick some random timing curve, it's not going to feel super natural, right? Even if you have a timing curve that's based on the Bezier path, it's not going to feel natural because what you're essentially trying to animate is physics, but you're doing physics motion with not physics curves. So it's always going to kind of be in that uncanny valley. So I built a couple prototypes. I wasn't super happy with how it was just feeling. And then I had that realization of this is actually kind of like a high school physics problem, right? Joey is standing on the roof of his school and he throws a baseball with initial velocity of 500, whatever per second. Where does it land, right? And I was like, oh, this is actually like the exact problem, but inverted. We know where we want this ball to land, and we know that we want to inject some initial y velocity so it kind of goes up before it lands there. So I called up my sister, who's a math and calculus teacher in Detroit, Michigan, and I was like, hey, you trying to give me a refresher on the quadratic equation? And she was so happy. I think she used this example in her class for weeks after that. She's like, yes, absolutely. So we I'm in my workspace here, and I have every Tuesday I get a bunch of friends together and we jam on side projects and stuff. Got this big whiteboard over there. It looked like I just wrote a bunch of fake math to look cool, but I was actually trying to figure out how to solve for if we inject this much velocity going up and we know where it needs to land, how do we calculate the velocity going that way? Long story short, I actually modeled the physics for it, every single frame, to figure out where would it fall. So you have this natural gravitational fall, and that felt incredible. And it made it so it was super flexible. We could change how loopy it was even based on where you were clicking, right? Like if you're clicking up at the top of the desktop, we don't want to shoot it all the way into outer space, right? We want to just give you a little curve, right? And it's going to fall nicely. The other thing about doing it that way is that means on every single frame, we're not just saying, hey, animate on this Bezier curve. We know the exact position and velocity and acceleration on every single frame that this icon is moving. And that probably seems unnecessary, and I don't know, maybe it kind of is, but it's a lot of what I do with my life. If we have those values, we can actually drive other animations off those things. If you think about throwing an object, right? When the object is really close to the ground, you have this really intense shadow. And then as the object kind of moves up, the shadow radius becomes larger and the opacity goes down. And if we had the velocity, we know when the velocity hits zero. And so we can kind of tie those things together. Now the shadow is based on the position and the velocity. And then when it finally hits that destination position, we knew that final velocity. And with that final velocity, we could inject that into a spring and create this really juicy braking animation where the icon kind of squishes and deforms, right? It covered the design portions. it covered the artistic portions, and also was like nice to use some, some like basic calculus again, like, as like a design engineer now. So yeah, I was pretty happy with how that turned out.
I use AI every single day, but I never go to OpenAI or Claude or any of those websites because Raycast is my portal to AI. It's a quick keyboard shortcut away, which means it's always at my fingertips. I can add attachments and build really powerful presets to streamline my workflows. And it's a big reason why Raycast has really quickly become the cornerstone of how I use my computer. So if you haven't tried it yet, do yourself a favor and head to dive.club/Raycast to get started. That's RAYCAST. Okay, now on to the episode. I told my wife about this interview and I was like, yeah, I'm talking to Janum. He's at Airbnb. I was like, he's the guy that made the Arc download animation. And she's like, oh, she had this eyes light up moment. We're like,
so funny.
That's so cool.
It was actually like a little bit of a different type of animation for me to build because I generally build animations that are like highly interactive. And this is actually kind of the opposite, which is you click a link and we kind of render this fire and forget animation. And that's what's needed there. Like, it totally makes sense. For a second, I didn't have to have the constraint of like interruptibility and reversibility and retargeting and all that kind of stuff. I could just focus on making that fire and forget animation feel as good as possible.
I didn't even think about that. You're right. It actually does have less constraints because there's no way to stop it. As soon as it starts, it is going to continue. Okay, so let's back like all the way up in your journey. You studied engineering, you started a couple companies. Eventually, you find yourself in a full-time role at Apple. And maybe we could start the story there. So can you set the stage for what that role was like? And then we can dive into some of the specific details.
I was an engineer on a team called UIKit Frameworks. So UIKit is the set of frameworks that all apps are pretty much built with. Even a lot of SwiftUI stuff under the hood, it's like UIKit. When I was there, I actually worked really closely with our sister team, which is a team called Springboard System UI. And this is the team that builds everything on iOS that's not an app. So home screen, lock screen, app switcher, notifications, as well as all of the behind the scenes, under the hood stuff that no one ever thinks about. I really, really enjoyed working with them. So actually, the next year I moved over to that team and started working on the iOS app switcher, specifically for the iPad. The first project that I was working on there was on the iPad pointer, the kind of pointer that as you move around, it kind of morphs and does all that fancy stuff. I didn't work on the morphing, but I worked on the other side of it, which was like, okay, all of the navigation on iPad, it assumes that you have like your fingers on the glass, right? That you swipe up on the glass to go home and to move between apps and to go to Control Center and all that kind of stuff. How is this going to work in a world where you now just have a pointer, right? We still want you to be able to kind of like interactively go to the switcher or Control Center or these kinds of things. How's that going to work? So I spent a while kind of porting a lot of the touch-based gestures on iPad to work with the pointer. And that's really where I started getting really heavily involved with interaction, gestures, animation, where the rubber hits the road. You can't fake anything there, right? If you make something and for some reason it feels off or it feels bad, the experience of using this product just now feels bad. So it was a really high bar on a team that is really world-class, like engineers and interaction designers, right? Just by virtue of having that role. I learned so much being there. I particularly worked a lot with someone named Shabam on Springboard, who's now part of the design team over there. He had a really large role in building the original iPhone X fluid switcher, which I consider to be one of the wonders of the world. And for everything he would make, it just felt incredible. It felt alive and dynamic and responsive. And so I spent so much time trying to look at his patches and pull requests to just try to learn the tricks of how do you actually make these interactions feel great, right? From the level of like, what is animation? You're transitioning from one state to another, but you can model this as progress at 0 and then progress at 1, interpolating between those two numbers. You get to change the curve, right? Maybe it's linear, maybe it's ease in. Ideally, you can actually use a spring, which has a notion of velocity and momentum. That way, when you change an animation, it doesn't jerk to the new destination. It kind of fluidly moves to that. So I started learning a lot of the engineering techniques of building fluid interfaces from him and that team, and just like totally fell in love with the craft. I'm like constantly working on little side projects and stuff. I'll just have like an idea in my head, and I need to like build it from scratch to satisfy that itch. So I was doing a lot of that on the side. And then, eventually I was kind of feeling like, all right, like this is like an amazing experience being on this team. I've been in Apple for a little bit. I kind of want to have more of a hand in the design and prototyping parts of this process. And I think Apple's a bit more top down. You have maybe less room to move laterally. So I went over and joined Netflix.
One of the first projects that I saw of yours was the Netflix iOS app and all of the different little interaction details that were going viral on Twitter at the time. Can you give us a little bit of a backstory for that project?
They were really interested in trying to take the Netflix iOS app, which had been around for a while, super functional, very stable, very solid. They were starting to move into introducing games to the platform, as well as some other verticals of the business, and they wanted to figure out how can we make this app feel a little bit more alive and dynamic, right? Versus kind of like a vending machine or something like that. And so my manager, she kind of knew my interest was really in this fluid dynamic UI or whatever. She was like, do you want to take a stab at doing something to the app? And, I think in my spare time when I had cycles at Netflix, I was doing some prototyping already and posted some fun demos. And I think that kind of got people excited. And so I was like, yes, absolutely. So she gave me that opportunity, which I'm forever grateful for. She kind of just left me alone for the next 9 months in the best way possible. Like, obviously, we check in every week, but she just left me. I started working really closely with my design partner there, Ben Johnson, who's been there for 7-8 years at this time. And he was so excited that someone else wanted to bring the app into this new era. So, next 9 months, we were just jamming on designs and prototypes together and tweaking things. I was also responsible for building the thing as well, with the help of an engineer named Adam Bell, who is a fantastic engineer at these UIs. He worked on Facebook paper and stuff. And yeah, in about a year, we shipped this refresh of Netflix.
One of the things that you said about this project was your goal was to make it fluid, delightful, and polished. Those were the words you used. So how did you then think about the right areas to inject animation when you're kind of given a clean slate to do anything that you really want? Talk to me a little bit about the model that you were using for what if we did this over here or over here? What were those core surfaces that you wanted to explore first?
I think one of the first ones that we knew we wanted to do was that shared transition from the artwork to the detail page. That seemed kind of like a no-brainer, right? It's like, okay, we have this beautiful artwork already. We can kind of bring out the tones of those colors and make that detail page more immersive, right? Before, Netflix was just all black everywhere. It was content and then black. We had this huge billboard up at the top. And so we were also thinking could we make the colors kind of match the artwork? That was a really long process. It's again, I think this is a great example of it's really easy to create a mock of the homepage with some particular hero artwork and then draw a gradient that looks just incredible. And then figuring out how you systematize that and do it automatically is really, really annoying. And, we tried all sorts of things. We tried blowing the image up and then applying blurs and then saturation filters and stuff like that. We tried creating mesh gradients. We tried straight up extracting colors and then putting that there. And everything looked really, really wrong. In the end, we weren't oh, the technique is just this, do that. No, it was 200 lines of color extraction for a piece of artwork. And then we'd meticulously tune and tweak the hues and the saturations and the brightnesses. If the hue is a yellow, we discard that color and then we find another one and we tune those components as well to draw this gradient. So I think that's another good example of that design engineering intersection as well.
And you've seen this UI in places, even in something like Apple CarPlay, for instance. And I guess I assumed that you were blowing up the image and blurring, but 200 lines and color extraction, that's really fascinating, actually.
Yeah, and it's not perfect too, right? You can get into states where it looks a little bit too gray or washed out or this or that, but I think we got it to a decent position. Sometimes when I look at the Netflix app now, I just see all the things that I would have wanted to improve and I didn't have time to do it. I have to remind myself that for what I did in that year, it was good.
I didn't realize how much you were touching the actual design of the app rather than the interaction animation side. Were there other places where you're okay, in order to unlock this level of delight, actually, we do need to make a design tweak here?
Yeah, the whole project was the design did change, right? It wasn't we designed this new art direction for the homepage and then figured out how do we tack on interactions, right? We wanted the whole thing to feel very cohesive. The language matched the interactions, matched the motion of things and the content. It was a little bit we're kind of boiling the ocean for a little bit.
So given the fact that you're boiling the ocean, you're making all of these design decisions. How much were you having to like get sign off on these different directions, or hey, we're going to invest all this time in figuring out this like dynamic color background? What was it like having to present these ideas, and how often did you have to?
Netflix is a pretty different kind of company. One, it's not traditionally like a super product design led company, which is, I think, good and bad. And I think the opportunity there is like there's maybe like a little bit less scrutiny if you're trying to push the boundaries of things. We had our director VP sign off on this experiment, right? We were going to A/B test this before actually rolling it out to everyone. And we decided, okay, we're willing to budget this amount of time and have a couple people work on this, and we'll see how it goes. In terms of all these approvals and reviews, we really didn't have a lot. We would demo it to a couple people in leadership in the hallway, and they're like, cool, keep going. I think at Netflix, like, they hire good people, they trust you a lot to be a good steward of the product, of the design, of the engineering. And if you read their culture memo, they're like, yeah, and if you're not doing that, we'll fire you.
All right, so you're introducing all of this animation and movement in, like you said, kind of this boil the ocean type project. There's kind of a spectrum that in my mind exists here, where on one hand, you're very intentionally saying, okay, these are the curves that we're going to formalize, and we're going to ensure all of the standardization and how things move throughout all of the different surfaces. And on the other, it's kind of, for each individual implementation, you're saying what looks and feels best here. As someone who is doing a lot of prototyping and a lot of interaction design, how much do you care about the standardization of these animations?
Yeah, it's a great question. I am not really in the standardization camp for constants that affect animations and springs and curves and things like that. I think in the design process, you have this final step at the end called tuning that I don't think people really talk about or give much credence to. But I think really step one is you build the thing and you kind of iterate on the core functionalities of the interaction. And then at the end, you get to this point where you need to make sure all your springs have the right damping and they're not too tight, but they're not too soft. And that's a step where you just have to change one number by 0.02 and try it again and again and again. And you end up with this big file of tuned constants. Like, don't touch it, right? They're not going to be standard because a lot of times it doesn't make sense to fully standardize these numbers because, spring animation that moves something just like 50 points, it's going to feel really different than that same spring being used to translate across the whole screen and become super large, right? I think standardization, like everyone loves this idea. If you really want to make stuff that feels good and feels really tailored to the exact animation that you're building, you have to do the tuning step and it's not going to match what your design system says.
Okay, so you do this big visual and interaction overhaul, you release it. It doesn't sound like you got fired, so I think it was at least somewhat successful. Can you talk to us a little bit about what the impact of the project was?
The app with the update got approved on like a Friday, and then the next Monday I was starting at BrowserCo. So I really, really threaded that line, and I very narrowly made it happen. But what was funny is like I didn't actually like know the outcome of it till after the fact, right? Like I had a weekend, Monday woke up, I was now at BrowserCo. I was like, man, wonder how this is gonna go. At this point, I did know Netflix like runs these, A/B tests, so we have a good sense of how this is gonna impact metrics. I was talking to our data partner, and he was like, we have a statistically significant sample come back, and the result is suspiciously large. I was like, oh God, suspiciously bad? He's like, no, all these core metrics are substantially in the green. When you're operating at that scale, I was really expecting all those core metrics to be slightly in the red to neutral. And we kind of accounted for that. If we're going to make a substantial change to the art direction and design language of Netflix with the hope of bringing it to other canvases and other platforms, we're probably going to take a little bit of a short-term hit. And then we'll find out what's causing that regression and we'll fix it, right? The sample came back and it was, yep, all core business metrics are positive by a substantial margin. And it's just not really what I was expecting. And I never sold this idea in terms of, oh, I'm going to promise you positive metrics increases. But it was. And it really objectively, empirically showed that craft does affect the business, right? It is not kind of like a vanity exercise in doing art school in software. It's like this thing can really have a tangible impact on those things, right? And again, I still to this day, I don't sell craft under that idea, but it's really nice now knowing like I've seen what this can do. And if we need to make that kind of case, we can make that kind of case and test that.
I mean, it's cool to hear. I wonder how many people are going to cite this conversation even, because so often that level of craft and detail is sold under this umbrella of, well, it's an investment into things that you can't really measure, but they are important. We promise they're important, but you can't really tell. And so to hear that it had empirical impact is really, really cool.
Yeah, totally. It's like investing in feel is you're effectively investing in people liking using your product. There's a million products that have terrible feel and people hate using them. And they complain to whoever is forcing them to use these things. And as soon as they're not forced to use it, they immediately throw it in the garbage. Feel is product quality, just like stability, performance, all those kinds of things. They're all in the same bucket.
Hey guys, real quick, if you know me, then you know I love products. So I want to take just 30 seconds to tell you about 3 of my favorites. Now, anytime that I'm designing and building a website, you better believe that I'm going to use Framer. I made the switch recently and I'm never going back. Now, once it's time to animate my designs and showcase my work, that's when I'm going to use Jitter. It's like Figma, only for motion design. And every step of the way, I'm going to be using Raycast constantly. It's the cornerstone of how I use my computer and the way that I stay in flow while I work. Now, I hand-selected Framer, Raycast, and Jitter to partner with me so that I could do these interviews full-time. So if you want to show them some love, it would mean a lot. Okay, now on to the rest of the episode. It's interesting to think about what the impact would have been if there was more of like incremental releases and you're like, hey, we're going to just take this surface area and invest in feel, and then this surface area, and then this surface area. Would it have been in the red or been neutral to the point where maybe the entirety would have never been greenlit?
Yeah, 100%. We made a pretty conscious decision to take this bet of we're just going to test this. We're going to have the control group that doesn't enable any of this stuff. We're going to have the main group that turns everything on, and then one third group that turns off the zoom transition just in case we literally screwed up the engineering for it. But we were like, we're going to test this as a whole thing, because as soon as we start breaking this refresh up, it's no longer a refresh. You've just kind of created this Frankenstein's monster. You end up with something like really strange and nonsensical, and it's not going to feel the same, right? So we didn't do that. I think our bet paid off there.
Okay, so you mentioned going from Netflix to the browser co. We talked a little bit about that. Now you're actually at Airbnb. You've been here almost a year, so it's still kind of new, but talk to us a little bit about how your kind of day-to-day role has evolved now that you're in another new environment like Airbnb.
The arc of my career has very much been started full-on product engineering. And I still love engineering products, right? But I kind of got more and more interested in interaction design and prototyping, animation, interaction, things like that. I went from Apple and then I went to Netflix, where my role was really split 50-50, but I still had a massive amount of engineering to do. Then I went to Browser Co, and the proportion of engineering shrank down to maybe, 30% in terms of contributing to the production code base, right? And then I joined Airbnb, where my role is, I think I'm a design engineer. I do a lot of prototyping. I do a lot of interaction design, especially things that are motion or gestural in nature. I also do a lot of proof of concepting. The designers there are really ambitious, which is fantastic. And sometimes they'll come up with an idea that they're not quite sure how to approach. So I can kind of break down that piece of tricky UI and provide a reference example of how you can do this. My role is pretty broad in that it changes fairly frequently. I stay on a project for a month or two, depending on what it is, but I'm just moving around the company, making prototypes, creating demos, figuring out what are some technical unlocks for some new design that we want to do. Sometimes I'm doing a more large-scale prototyping across the product.
Listening to you talk about proof of concepting, it does feel like it's almost necessitated because there are designers that really push the boundaries, and Airbnb has this really high level of craft and interaction that maybe a lot of people listening to this, they don't work at that type of company, which kind of makes me curious. How many people are there at Airbnb that do this type of role that you're in, where you're really kind of sitting as, in many ways, the bridge between traditional designers and traditional engineering? Is it a common role? Are there a lot of you? And how does that kind of fit into the org?
I would not say there are a lot of that role. I'm kind of like a leaf node, like a free electron. There are a couple other teams that have similar roles focusing on prototyping. I'd estimate maybe on the order of 10 or a dozen around the company.
Wow.
And I think it's something that the company is interested in investing more, because having people that are able to fully speak and do both those jobs, you're able to both design things that are actually more ambitious, and you have the technical capability and knowledge to actually ship it, right? If you don't have that glue in between, You kind of have a harder time with one or both of those aspects.
Does the prototyping role imply that you are not often contributing to prod?
So this is actually the first job where I just haven't done that at all. I'm still doing a ton of very technical work, right? When I'm designing stuff, I'm not really in Figma very often. If I'm in Figma, I'm using it as kind of like a Photoshop, trying to white out some rectangle and replace it with another rectangle or something like that. Like really rudimentary stuff. Like I think if you see me in Figma, you're like, oh my God, this guy should never design anything. Most of the time, I'm designing and creating interfaces and prototypes in code. That's where I'm comfortable, and it's where I can actually build something that I can play with and I can see how it feels, right? See how all those seams actually fit together. I think that's the biggest value of prototyping is once you actually have something that you can play around with, you intuitively know what's wrong with the thing that you have, right? In a way that is maybe not as obvious if you're working in renders or mocks or something like that.
Listening to you talk, I kind of assumed that you were living in SwiftUI all day, but that's not the case. So can you talk to me a little bit about that?
The thing that I really like about designing interactions or prototypes or generally software is making stuff that just feels absolutely fluid and responsive and immersive, right? Like every last detail. Because if you start cutting the details out, it kind of breaks that immersion. And one of the ways that you can break that immersion is having poor performance, right? Dropping frames. You're dragging something around and it's kind of stuttering, or you throw a box up to the left or something and it kind of stutters, or it changes direction in a way that doesn't quite feel natural or right. I think SwiftUI does, especially when it comes to more complex animations, interactions, gestures, I think it does have a lot of those performance issues. And then I think the declarative nature of SwiftUI makes it a little bit more difficult to actually debug and kind of open up the box to see what's going wrong in there. A lot of my work, like all the Netflix work, for example, that's all UIKit and core animation because it needed to be highly custom, and not just that, it needed to never drop a frame, right? Independent of what other parts of the app are using resources. We just needed to maintain a really, really high quality bar. I'm not quite sure that SwiftUI is like necessarily that level of production ready right now. And then also my demos, I was not super happy with the existing animation APIs on iOS, be it SwiftUI or UIKit. So a couple years ago, I worked with my friend Ben to write a library called Wave that I now use for pretty much everything. Sometimes the right tool for the job is a metal shader. Sometimes it's like you can't even work in rectangle land if you want to create some kind of visual effect. I think if you want to create the Apple Intelligence waveform effect around the border of the phone, good luck doing that in rectangle land. Why? Because they're not rectangles. In the last year, I've also gotten fairly comfortable writing shaders, and that opens up a whole new world. Sometimes the answer is not even software at all. Sometimes the answer is really just have some stuff in Figma and do some magic moves and solve it at that level first.
All right, so you hit on like 4 different things that I wanted to ask questions about. So we're going to kind of just go down the line and get into some specifics. One of the things I really wanted to talk about is, like, in your opinion, what makes software feel great? You mentioned performance. You said this phrase, every last detail. What are some of those other details that to you are necessary for something to truly feel great?
This is like the holy question, right? Let's kind of assume we're talking about something interactive, something that's somewhat animated, right? Level 1 is you create an animation that's fire and forget. You press a button that displays a modal and it runs that animation, and you have to wait for that full animation to finish before you can use the content in it or before you can dismiss it, right? You're just locked in. That's not great because it's not super responsive. You are thinking about how you want to use this piece of software faster than the software is letting you do it. So the next step is making that animation interruptible. As that modal is coming up, I should be able to tap the background and have it change its direction immediately, right? Level 3 is how do we actually make that change of direction feel more smooth? Because it's kind of, if that modal is coming up and then you dismiss it and then it just kind of jerks back down, like, yeah, I mean, that's interruptible. It doesn't feel that good. So the next step is you actually want to maintain the momentum of these interactions. If there's a lot of momentum going up, then it should slowly curve back down before hiding again, right? And that's something that we call like retargeting, right? It's maintaining the momentum of animations as you change where they're animating to. And then, if we go back to that idea of like modeling animations as moving between progress values of 0 and 1, you're interpolating between the 0 state and the 1 state. But then also what happens beyond those 2 points? What happens when you're pushing beyond one of those edges? right? A really good example is scrolling on iOS. If you scroll to the bottom of a page, it doesn't just stop. At that point, you are past 100% progress, but you can still actually pull it. And what's actually happening is when that progress is greater than 100, we're actually rubber banding that progress value. So you can pull it, but it gets tighter and tighter and tighter, and you can't really pull it much more, but it's telling you that, hey, there's not a bug here. This is the end. There's nothing past it, and the software's not broken, right? So also considering what happens outside of that ideal context of 0 to 1. That's super important. And then you just generally have this idea of responsivity. Whenever you are interacting with the UI should be responding in some regard. Obvious example is like, okay, you're scrolling and, you need to be scrolling like 1 to 1. It's even the little things. It's like, if you look at the Netflix zoom transitions, the reason those boxes depress down a little bit before expanding up is because you're almost kind of pushing this box down on a spring and then it springs back up to you. So, I know like Disney or Pixar has those 12 principles of animation, right? So those really apply to UI work as well, too. I think there's a million things. And I think there's like a million details that you just have to make a bunch of stuff to figure out why the stuff you made kind of feels bad and then actually find that principle. Like I'll give you another example, which is, I don't think this is like something that people really know about, or I think it's like such a great thing on iOS, but people have such good muscle memory when they're typing on the keyboard on iOS, right? They'll go into iMessage, they'll open up the text box, and then as that keyboard is still animating up, people naturally will start typing even before it's fully presented. They're typing against buttons that aren't yet there, right? But the designers knew that. They knew that people have muscle memory. So even though those keys are still animating up and you're pressing over here, we should pretend like the keyboard is actually there. These things are like not obvious, right? But then if you take that away and you actually make it so you have to hit the exact moving key target as it's animating up, people will like lose their mind, right? It's a million small things. And if anyone is interested in studying these principles more broadly, I mean, the holy text here is the 2018 WWDC talk, Designing Fluid Interfaces. And this is the talk with some of the primary designers of the fluid switcher from the iPhone 10, kind of talking about all the principles that led into all those new gestures. So that is where everyone should start. And then just make a bunch of stuff and figure out why it's not that good.
We'll definitely add that to the show notes for people as a next step. The next thing I want to talk about then is, okay, given these like million details that you have to think about, why did you decide that you needed to create the animation engine Wave? Like, what were the gaps that you were trying to fill? And maybe you could even just give us a little bit of an idea of like, what does it actually take to build something like this? So with the understanding that you are talking primarily to designers with an interest in engineering, maybe it's like the explain like an 8th grader version. Talk to us about what it took to pull that off.
So I'll start with why I decided to make Wave. And I'll start with an example on the iPhone, which is picture-in-picture. You're watching a video and then you get that little pip thing. If you pick it up and throw it around, it always lands in one of those 4 corners. But at the moment that you release it, it doesn't just jerk to one of those corners. Kind of based on the intensity and the speed of your swipe, it kind of gracefully arcs and curves and kind of bounces back and finds its home. The magic that's happening there is when you release your finger, that drag, you have some velocity in there, and it's pointing this way. And the target's up here. But what's happening is, even though it's animating to the top, the velocity is going the other direction, so those springs are going to actually, still push a little bit this way and then kind of curve back. And it turns out that a lot of the APIs in UIKit and SwiftUI don't really have that great support for maintaining that velocity or maintaining that momentum. And if you don't have good control over that, things are just going to feel stiff. They're going to feel jerky. They're not going to feel natural. And I was really frustrated with that. I decided to start writing Wave, which makes it really easy to, the idea with Wave is you just tell it where you want some animation to end up, whether that's a position or a size or a color. And then at any time, you can change your mind. You can say, actually go over here, actually change to this color, and everything will kind of gracefully move. Facebook created a similar engine a long time ago called Pop. This is the engine that they used to make Facebook Paper feel so fluid. And Pop, it's pretty old. I think it's like pretty unmaintained now. And so I wanted something that still felt modern and gave you a lot of control. So that's what Wave was. And in terms of what it was like to build it, I mean, it was a lot of actually learning and understanding and trying to break apart how spring physics actually works. When you throw around these terms of stiffness or damping versus damping ratio or response or, whatever, it's like, turns out you're going to need to read a lot of Wikipedia pages with a lot of incomprehensible math notation and figure out how you translate that into code, right? So I had help with Ben, and I think without him, this would have been impossible. But yeah, I mean, I think to this day, it's one of the things that I'm more proud of, because it was really nice to build a tool that it was exactly the tool that I needed to make the kinds of software and UI that I wanted to make. And then it happens to be open source, and other people happen to like using it. It was really a labor of love, and it was just like a building my own tool thing.
All right, so the other thing that you started talking about was shaders. And like, for anyone that is listening that's like ever been on Twitter, like, it's almost impossible as a designer to not come across the word shader now. And yet it's kind of this black box for people who don't really get into code. So I know this is not the easiest of questions, but can you help designers who have no real idea what a shader is understand it a little bit better, but also talk about like, what does it make possible? Like, why is it such a big deal, and why is it becoming so popular?
I'll start with like why it's becoming popular, especially in the last year, which is SwiftUI just made it a lot easier to take a shader that you wrote and apply it to a SwiftUI view. Before, it was a process to write the shader, but then you had to write like a ton of boilerplate and setup and infrastructure to just get it plugged in. And
I didn't know that.
That was like a huge step that made it, not very fun for people to dabble with. So that's why it got popular. So what are shaders? Okay. Shaders are these little programs that run on every single pixel on a screen. So if you think about like traditional software, you might say, okay, I want to create a rectangle that's 100 by 100 points, and I want to put it in the center of the screen. And you just like set its position, and it's like there. It's really easy to reason about. It's very quick. The issue is that in some senses you are kind of limited in what you can do with that UI to things that are fundamentally like rectangular in form or some other kind of polygon or shape, right? But it's a little bit limited to like what your primitives are. Now, let's say you wanted to create some effect. Maybe it's like a shimmer effect or a little ripple or a Siri waveform thing. These are things that are not easily or really at all expressible in 2D UI land, right? So this is where shaders come in. A shader is a little program that you write that runs concurrently on every single pixel on screen, every single frame. And this sounds like really, really crazy, right? And it's like, okay, well, like, how is this like possible? And surely this must be like extraordinarily inefficient. The trick here is that these little shader programs, they actually run on the GPU on your phone or your computer. And the GPU is really, really good at running 10,000 of these programs all at the same time. Like, that's what it's optimized to do. It's saying, hey, I'm a pixel at this coordinate. What color should I be? So I could draw that same box in a shader, right? And it would look something like, okay, I am a particular point. Am I within this box? If so, return blue. Otherwise, return black, right? That's a very simple shader that kind of illustrates this question of the shader is coming from the perspective of the pixel, which is a really weird thing to kind of invert your thinking. What it lets you do is like really, really crazy visual effects because you are now operating on individual pixels, and you can do ripples and shimmers and things like that. You can also, I have one little example that it's one of my demos. For people that actually are good at shaders and have done this for a long time, this will not be too impressive for you, but I made this little example lock screen that it's this little mountain terrain thing, right? And it can kind of pan around. This is not a video or like some pre-built asset. That all the mountains themselves that's all in one shader. There is one shader that's saying, I am a pixel at this position. What color should I be? And it turns out you can do like a bunch of like absolutely crazy math called, if anyone's interested for some reason, they're called SDFs, sign distance fields or functions. And you can literally create 3D terrains. So video games have been doing this for like forever, right? All the video games that you play, those are all shaders. They are much more new in kind of like UI design land because, the learning curve is, I would say, substantially more difficult. But I think maybe a good exercise to like anyone, engineers or designers that are interested in playing around with this a little bit is like take some random JPEG image, put it on screen, and then apply a shader on it, and even just try to tweak the red value of it or something like that, right? Or just write some simple one-line changes the base color. Another resource that we should put into the show notes is the site called thebookofshaders.com. That's a very good interactive tutorial that's really accessible to anyone that kind of helps you understand this stuff.
Well, you just easily doubled my own understanding of shaders, so thank you. That was quite comprehensive and appreciated. You talked a little bit about some of these demos. I mean, I looked at the 3D mountain landscape background and just mind-blowing. Can you share a little bit more about some of the things that you're exploring and all these little passion projects and demos that you're working on?
I often find myself thinking of like random, interesting UI interactions or animations or something. And I'm like, oh, like, wouldn't it be cool if like that existed? Like, how would that work? How would that feel? So I have this like little wave demos project that it's like probably a collection of like 30 or 40 different demos that I've created over the years of just totally random ideas. I have this really, really long running doc of, it's kind of my dumping ground for all of these ideas that just come to me and I'll take down, and I make some small portion of it, and then some small portion of the things that I make are like actually good, so some of those I'll post. But making junk is kind of part of the process, right? Some of the times there are things like, oh, I see some other piece of software did this really wild UI effect. How did they do that? Technically, like, how is that even possible? What's happening there? I remember one good example of this is when the dynamic island came out. And when the dynamic island kind of splits into those two balls using that meta ball animation, I was like, that is just ridiculous. That's fresh and new, and I have no idea how to build it. And again, that doesn't fall under the rectangle paradigm. And so, I did a bunch of research. I was like, oh, this is that same kind of thing, sign distance functions, and I can maybe do this in a shader. And so I made a little meta ball demo, and then I was like, oh, I could make these balls draggable, and I could throw them around and inject velocity into it. So I have a vague idea of where I want to go, or I have some kernel of an idea. And then as I'm building it, I'll just be like, oh, what if I just tried this? Wouldn't it be cool if it did that? And it just becomes something else. Some of them work out and a lot of them don't, but they are all fundamentally ideas or concepts that like nerd sniped me in some sense. They were ideas that I couldn't not build. Otherwise, it would affect my sleep.
The phrase rectangle paradigm is kind of buzzing in my brain right now because in some ways it's like there's safety in that as a designer who has basically built a career in the rectangle paradigm, right? There are constraints and bumpers and things are predictable and everything is a box and a box and a box. And man, when I first saw Dynamic Island demo, that day that it just took over Twitter, it was like humbling, like deeply humbling, where it's like, oh my gosh. I mean, that is just so far outside of my personal playground where all of a sudden it's like, geez, like literally anything is possible. Like I can think of anything. The bar for creativity and the execution to match is so much higher than when you're just drawing rectangles instead of rectangles.
Yeah, I think shaders kind of, in a lot of ways, they're like the final frontier in UI development, right? It's like the ultimate escape hatch, that you are no longer limited by anything that your framework or design system or software library gives you. You are just given this canvas, and it is fully up to you to figure out what to do with it.
Do you have any thoughts on Cursor and some of these new tools that are coming out? Like, how much are you making use of AI even in this process? Because I'm scrolling Twitter, especially over the last 4 or 5 days, and it's like every single time I open up, some designer is shipping some awesome piece of code that was previously not possible. So I'm wondering, you as someone with a little bit more of an engineering background, what's your take on what's happening in the landscape right now?
I don't use like Cursor. I don't have any of these like, Copilot extensions or anything like that. They seem like pretty helpful in terms of making writing boilerplate a lot quicker. I think it also goes a long way in helping people like understand new concepts, having like a little bit of like a personal tutor to point you in the general direction of what do I need to do here. So I think that's fantastic. Right? I'm in support of anything that kind of like makes it easier for people to like learn and create on their own.
It makes me wonder how low we can push the technical requirements in order to express yourself through shaders, because that's just such an interesting world to imagine. Like, how accessible can we make it, where I wonder if someday in the maybe not as distant future as we might think, people anywhere with a little bit of technical know-how could like make software that is inherently art. That's a world that gets me excited to think about.
A little bit you see this in the game development industry where they're writing shaders all day, but they actually don't write lines of shader code. They actually have these programs that are actually pretty similar to how origami works. They're these node-based shader editors that you have some inputs and you feed it into this node and do something else in the shader. And eventually all of that does get baked into a shader behind the scenes. But I think that lowers that barrier a lot too. If you're a designer and you're kind of interested in bringing some of your own ideas to life and move up on the fidelity spectrum, realistically, I probably wouldn't start with shaders. I think that's like maybe a decent way to freak yourself out. You know what I mean? Like, I'd take a couple baby steps before jumping into that. But it is there as like a final boss for when you're ready.
Okay, so let's zoom out really quickly. And before I let you go, that actually tees up the last question that I wanted to ask you kind of perfectly. Because I think right now, a lot of people are able to clearly see the two potential learning journeys. You have design, you learn this, then this, then this, then this, and you have engineering. And it's like, if you look up any blog post about how to learn engineering, it's like, well, you learn HTML, then you learn CSS, then you learn JavaScript, and then maybe you can start getting into frameworks. And I look at your role, and you really have created this very interesting niche kind of in between the two. Yeah, technically you're in engineering right now, but you're doing a lot of design work and everything that you're working on is inherently visual. So for someone that's listening to this and they're inspired by your journey and they want to think about a learning path that they can chart for themselves to help get to this more specialized role where, yeah, maybe they're not actually contributing production code, but they want to be able to do these really interesting animations. So how do you think about that first set of steps that they could take in order to get to where you are today?
My recommendation is you just got to start building stuff. You got to start by building something really, really simple. Can I just get a box on screen? And then, okay, can I tap the screen to have it move over there? Just snowballing tiny bits and learning as you go, especially for this kind of design, engineering, fluid UI, like, I don't know, whatever it is that I do. There's no laid out path for it. There are no courses for it. A lot of that knowledge is kind of discovered along the way or through some accidental apprenticeship. I think the most effective and honestly the only thing that you can do is just start building things, right? Like whether that's, getting started with SwiftUI and, seeing some kind of interesting demo and then trying to break apart the anatomy of like what it is that you're seeing on screen. Oh, I see this piece moving here. This thing changes color. This thing fades out, and just slowly trying to like layer each piece bit by bit and learning on the way. And then, so I think especially if you're coming in from the design side and you want to start bringing these things to life, I think you're going to have like the eye or glass problem. And if you're not familiar, there's a little essay called On Taste. It essentially talks about how you get into doing something because you have good taste. You know what good things look like and feel like, but your execution skills are not quite there. And as designers, that sense is honed till 10x, right? Yeah. So you're going to make stuff that is really, really bad. But the process of looking at what you made, trying to understand what feels bad about it, and then trying to like research and tweak and tune things to make it feel slightly less bad over and over again, that is the journey of making world-class software. And it is also not enough to make something that you're like, yeah, this is a decent approximation and stop there. It's like, no, like half the value is in that like last 10%. All those fine details, right? Because I think if you're willing to get your hands dirty and write some code, you might as well use that superpower to get those details actually right. And it's a journey, but I think it's one that people can do.
Awesome. Well, I'm sure that people listening are as inspired as I am. So, Janum, thank you for coming on and just giving a glimpse into this type of role. It's so interesting. Like, there's not, as you said, there's not like clear like playbooks or courses. Like, I don't even know if a lot of people even understand the type of role that you're in, and
I'm not even sure I do.
I wasn't gonna say it. You said it, not me. But you keep giving like 4 adjectives for what the role is, and I think it pretty much is a microcosm of the entire industry, even at this point. But if I had to bet on a subset of software and tech growing, it is this. And so I'm really, really grateful that you came on and shared a little bit about your journey and the types of things that you're exploring. And you even taught us about shaders. So thank you very much for your time.
Thanks so much for having me, Rid.
Hey, it's Rid. Don't forget, if you want to go even deeper, each week I send an email out to over 10,000 designers with bonus resources and key takeaways from these conversations. So head to dive.club/email to sign up. Okay, I'll see you next week.